Hello and welcome to my presentation on the ethical considerations of text simplification. So what actually is text simplification? Text simplification is an area of research in natural language processing which is focused on how to automatically adapt content to suit different audiences, and particularly different levels of complexity for different audiences. So as an example, you can see here on the left there's a paragraph of text and it's been simplified on the right. And broadly speaking, there's three main categories of simplification that take place. So one type of transformation when you're simplifying text is to identify words that might be difficult for a reader and then substitute the word or paraphrase the word. So this is typically known as lexical simplification or word simplification. Another type of simplification that can take place is conceptual simplification. So this has some parallels with the area of summarization. So here what you're doing is you're identifying a concept and you're trying to elaborate or explain what that concept actually means. Another type of simplification family is syntactic simplification. So this is where you might adapt sentences, the syntactic structure of sentences, to be simpler. So typically this might involve making sentences shorter or just simplifying the types of syntactic constructs that you come across. And typically, as a result of syntactic simplification, you might introduce discourse-based edits to maintain the coherence and flow of the text generally. So text simplification is all about how do we adapt content to suit different levels. And it's through these transformations that this typically takes place. And as a researcher in text simplification, I've been finding myself thinking for a while that sometimes the incentives that we have in the research around text simplification aren't necessarily aligned with the objectives and motivations that would be necessary if we wanted to embed text simplification into real-world applications. And one of the really cool things about this area of research is that text simplification can have massive impact in the world. There's many people who would benefit from being able to have text simplified to their level. However, if you are thinking about embedding this type of technology into applications, and especially assistive applications, then there are a range of ethical considerations that you need to bear in mind. So today I'm going to discuss the paper, which was kind of a first step of trying to think about and highlight what these different areas might be. And the first area is the intended audience. So in text simplification, as in many areas of research, we have tended to converge on a boilerplate kind of preamble for the paper, which outlines the motivations and the set of different audiences that actually might benefit from simplification. So here on the right, you can see there's 4 examples that I've taken from papers, and these were just recent papers by searching the ACL anthology. So you can see that actually there's a lot of repetition in these, and typically what this kind of boilerplate introduction does is it outlines all of the different audiences or people who would benefit from text simplification. So you see things like children, people with reading disorders, people from a low educational background, non-native speakers, and these types of groups are kind of brought up as motivation for why text simplification is a useful area. And whilst it's definitely true that text simplification could have applications for these different audiences, one of the issues with grouping all of these into kind of different areas together is that it gives the impression that general purpose simplification works well for all of these individuals. And actually this is not necessarily the case, and can be problematic because it means that the sensitive differences in needs for these groups is not really considered, and actually text simplification for each of these subgroups is more nuanced with respect to what type of simplification works well and what type of strategy might be the best for each of these individual groups. One of the things that's also interesting about this is that typically in these kind of boilerplate preambles, the different audiences and the citations that are used to purport the effectiveness of text simplification for these audiences are more nuanced and aren't as clear cut. So there's a couple of examples here where you can see that in this introduction, there's a line that says text simplification is very good for children, but actually when you read this paper, you find that using lexical and syntactic simplification, it couldn't reduce the difficulty of text enough for children, that actually maybe it needs to take place at a more conceptual level. And this is an important and kind of nuanced finding, which shows that actually for the audience of children, you might want to consider the types of simplifications that you perform. Similarly, when we consider dyslexia, so there's a very commonly used citation here, which outlines that text simplification is beneficial for those with dyslexia. But actually, when you look into this paper, one of the findings is that when you have someone with dyslexia, sometimes it can be better to provide synonyms for a word instead of actually substituting the word with a simpler alternative. And so whilst these are broadly in the same area, the subtleties are kind of lost here, and this can result in maybe not considering what might be best for a particular audience. And this is quite important because as researchers in text simplification, we need to consider that these algorithms will be used in a downstream way, often in assistive applications. And unless we're very clear about what does and doesn't work well for different audiences, this can actually cause more harm than good. So further on the point of the intended audience, we know that the majority of data sets that are used in text simplification, Simple Wikipedia and Newsella being two quite famous ones, the target audience that these datasets were created for is not necessarily the audience that we are then claiming text simplification could benefit from. So in the example of Simple Wikipedia, when you look at the instructions for people who are creating these articles, the only specification is that you use low-level vocabulary. And so this data set is probably very good for looking at how you can do word simplification, but might not be as effective for things like syntactic simplification. And similarly, when we consider the Newsella data set, this data set was created by English teachers who were adapting the content for children. And so this data set in particular might be quite effective for different levels of reading for children, but not necessarily for those who have particular reading disabilities. And similarly, when we consider the evaluation, we know that there's many automatic metrics that are used in text simplification. However, these are, again, looking at these data sets for a reference point. And so they tell us how well the particular model might perform in line with the expectation of the data set. But again, this might not be for the intended audience. And similarly, when we look at crowdsourcing, so now many papers tend to crowdsource annotations for how well simplifications have been performed. But one of the difficulties with this is that often the demographic information of the people who are making these decisions is not actually made publicly available. So whilst a simplification might be judged as a good simplification by someone who's crowdsourcing, they again might not be the target audience or demographic. So the second area of consideration is meaning distortion. So in text simplification, it's a text generation task. And as I'm sure many people know, when you are producing text via a machine learning model, sometimes there might be hallucinations or facts might not actually be included, especially in text simplification, where we're aiming to remove peripheral content that might be difficult to understand. And so here is an example. So this was an example of a state-of-the-art simplification algorithm. And what I've inputted here to make the point is some information about what to do if a child is choking. So this is text about health information on if someone is choking, what you should do. And you can see that generally the simplification has been performed quite well. However, don't poke blindly has been simplified to do not bag money as if unable to see or frequently. Now, clearly, this doesn't make sense. It's distorted the meaning, but part of the issue here is that this is really critical information. And when we consider using text simplification in assistive technology, we really need to be clear about how well these systems work, because if they're being used in very sensitive information or information such as health or political facts, it's really important that the meaning is not distorted. And currently this is something that is not often looked at within the literature. So we also have the third section, paternalism. And paternalism refers to interference by a state which restricts someone's autonomy. When we are considering text simplification, there's two different ways to choose what content should be simplified. So the first way is involving your reader in the loop. And so there are a couple of papers which are cited in the paper which look at selecting text to be simplified, or relying on eye tracking or eye movements to see where someone's finding something difficult, or even scroll behaviour. So one of the ways you can simplify content is by involving the reader in the loop. However, the majority of text simplification algorithms are actually black box end-to-end systems, and they learn simplification operations from the data that they're trained on. And part of the issue with this is that it restricts the choice of the reader. So if you are automatically simplifying content for someone, you are not giving them a choice in what is or isn't simplified. And this is restricting their autonomy, and again, in the paradigm of assistive technology, can be quite pernicious. And so this was an example from that health paragraph earlier. So you can see here the word try has been simplified to attempt, and the word remove has been simplified to take it away. But part of the problem here is that if you are accessing textual information via an assistive technology, if these words are always automatically simplified, you're taking away the opportunity for that individual to learn. And this is something that is very rarely discussed within the literature of text simplification, which is how do we ensure the right level of autonomy, this trade-off between the model automatically simplifying and the user being able to choose what they want to be simplified, as well as how do we make sure that there's not learning stagnation and that that individual is exposed to new terminology and new words. The final section, privacy and security, really looks at, it's kind of as a result of this prior point, which is if we actually do want to involve the reader in the loop, which can be very beneficial, then there becomes this issue of how do we make sure that this information is kept secure and is actually private, because this is actually very sensitive information if you're asking someone to select areas of text that they don't understand, especially when we consider eye tracking as a measure of understanding. And so, again, this is something that when you view text simplification through the paradigm of assistive technology and through a real-world application lens, factors like this start to become very important. And so to conclude, there are 4 main points that have been brought up in this paper, which look at text simplification through the paradigm of assistive technology and through the lens of real-world applications. So the first one is the intended audience. Are we making sure that these are designed for the right people and that we're being specific about who simplification works well for? The second, meaning distortion, if we are looking at sensitive information such as healthcare or political information, then are we making sure that these algorithms work well and preserve factual information? Thirdly, paternalism. Are we considering that we need to give the user autonomy in what they have simplified and provide learning opportunities? And finally, if we are doing so, then how do we ensure that this information is stored securely and privately? So to conclude, I would encourage you to go and read the paper. What I will say is text simplification is a highly impactful area and it has many real-world applications, and that's why I love working in this area. However, we do need to consider that a lot of the time, if our motivations are to put this technology in the hands of users, that there are more considerations that need to be discussed and thought through. And if you're interested in text simplification, Either follow me on Twitter or you can go to my website and join our Slack. Thank you for listening.